Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Catherine Leswing, and I work for the Bureau of Student Wellness at the New Hampshire Department of Education. If you have found this presentation, I commend you. I apologize for the technical difficulties we had with streaming this presentation to Facebook Live this morning, but we wanted to make sure that you do get the content. So hopefully you have found it if you were looking for it. So today I'm going to be talking about protective factors and student wellness. What is meant by protective factors are characteristics or assets that an individual has that serves to protect them against risk factors in their environment. So we'll dig a little bit deeper into that and some research behind it. Today's session is really a general overview about these different protective factors. On Friday, we'll be talking about how some of these protective factors, actually a lot of these protective factors, have been impacted by the switch to remote learning and how some students may have had, actually all students had certain protective factors just by nature of being in the school building, and some of those have fallen away. And so what can we do now as educators, caring adults, to build up some of those losses? My information is there if you have any questions or want to email me about any follow-up information. And just a reminder to like us on our social media channels, especially Facebook and YouTube. We're putting out quite a bit of content these days. YouTube Live, we are going every day at 3 p.m. with an interesting guest speaker series. So different folks from around New Hampshire who are really experts in different topics relating to student wellness. We're also on Twitter at NH Schools, and then those are our two websites. The first one being our website dedicated to remote learning, and then the bottom website is the website for our bureau. So looking at our topic for the day, protective factors, the big idea here is that in about 1989, the Search Institute, which is a nonprofit organization out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, identified 40 developmental assets that actually act as protective factors for youth against risky behaviors. And they did a ton of research around these developmental assets to see what happened when students had more of these assets and what happened when they had fewer of these assets. And what they found is not surprising, that there were better outcomes with the more developmental assets that a student had. So what this tells us is that adults can help build these assets to promote the well-being of all youth, right? Students, individuals, human beings, we're not static. We can learn new skills. Our environments shift, and that changes our perspective. And so today we're going to talk about the factors that they identified that serve as protective factors. And then, like I mentioned, on Friday, we'll go into how we can build up some of those. So here are some of their findings. And I think that this graph is really telling. So the gray bar is the bar that represents youth who had 31 to 40 assets. And we can see clearly that there's a direct correlation between having more assets and having better outcomes in one's life. So students with the most assets were more likely to succeed in school, value diversity, maintain good health, and exhibit leadership. Similarly, students with the fewest assets were less likely to do all of those things. And then when we look here at the risk factors that students are often presented with, or risky behaviors, we see that the students with the fewest assets, 0 to 10 assets, were much more likely to engage in alcohol and drug use, sexual activity, and violence. So this research is really pretty stark. It paints a very clear picture. And then this pie chart tells us what percentage of youth possess each number of assets. So we have here we have in the dark blue is the students that possess the most number of assets. So 31 to 40 assets is that navy blue chart with only 11%. So when we think back to that graph with the students who have the most assets are really outperforming, having high levels of success in school and in life, but we see that actually that group of students is a very small portion of the pie. The average number of assets that youth had was about 20. And this is all data that came from the surveys that the Search Institute distributed most recently in 2012 to 2015. And it was 120,000 youth, roughly ages, are in grades 6 through 12. So we see we have our work cut out for us, right? Not even 50% of the youth today have more than 20 assets. What compounds this further is the risk factors that exist for our youth in New Hampshire. So from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey in New Hampshire in 2017, this is some data that came out of it. And it found that 30% of youth reported living with someone who had or has a problem with drugs or alcohol in the home. 25% report going hungry at some point because there was not enough food. 15% seriously considered attempting suicide. 14% reported hearing domestic violence in the house, and 9% had at least one parent in prison or jail. So these are very grave statistics. They hit harder right now because we know that students are in these environments all day, every day. And on top of it, some of the protective factors that we were just talking about in the previous slide have now been removed because students aren't going to the school building. So again, we will talk about all of that, or we'll talk about ways that we can address the loss of protective factors on Friday. Right now, what I'd like to do, though, is really get into what are the protective factors that the Search Institute has identified. So there, as mentioned, there's 40 developmental assets. I'm using that interchangeably with protective factors. The external assets are opportunities, supports, relationships that help build up students. And then internal assets are more of the personal skills and values that a student has. So the next slide has broken down the different 40 assets into these different buckets. So we'll talk about support, empowerment, and all 8 subcategories of the 40 developmental assets. So starting with support, this is discussing the love, care, appreciation, acceptance that young people feel from their environment. A lot of these happen in the home. Family support, positive family communication, caring neighborhoods. We're seeing a lot of folks have really caring neighborhoods these days, parent involvement in schooling. But there are a couple that are exclusive to the school environment, or to being outside the home, not on a stay-at-home order. So those are other adult relationships and a caring school climate. So we can see that remote learning is really presenting the loss of 2 of these developmental assets. Empowerment is our next category here. This is talking about assets that make youth feel valued and valuable. One in particular that is really impacted by the closure of schools is school safety. And this one I think is a very big one, because when we think about the number of hours that a student spends in the school building per week, often they are spending more time in the school building on weekdays than they are in their home, more waking hours. This is a huge loss for many of our students. for all of our students, but for some, this really has more serious impacts than others on well-being. So it's something to think about. We can also think about how do we build up community values, or how the community values youth as resources and service to others. I think a lot of us have been seeing that shift recently, which is really great. Boundaries and expectations is talking about setting clear rules, and encouragement for students to make good choices. The family is really in charge of, um, or has power over a lot of boundaries and expectations, but the school is also a place where students have reinforced clear rules, boundaries, and consequences. So there is a big loss that's happening here with students switching to remote learning. Now we're switching to or I apologize, we have one left, on the external assets, and that's constructive use of time. There are a lot of ways that youth can use time constructively in the home, and we're seeing folks get very creative. We also know that a lot of this has to do, with doing these things through the screen, and there's a big challenge there. The school provides so many places for students to do things constructively with their time: after school programs, before school programs, opportunities for service, sports, leisure, music lessons, creative activities, you name it. The school is really a hub for constructive use of time, and so much of that has been taken away. And so how do we build that back up? Now we're moving into the internal assets, which are, again, the personal skills and the values that students build up to have a positive worldview of themselves. The first one here is commitment to learning, hugely impacted by school closures. How do we maintain that commitment to learning? How do we build up these individual assets of achievement motivation, school engagement, homework, bonding to school, and reading for pleasure? We can see that school engagement and bonding to school would really truly be impacted by school closures, but the other ones are tangentially impacted as well. So that's something we will talk about more on Friday. Positive values. Again, the family has so much impact on how students and youth develop qualities like caring about equality and social justice, integrity, honesty, responsibility, and restraint. And the school is also a place that explicitly teaches these things and reinforces them. So how do we do that virtually? How do we do that when we're not attending the school building? We're definitely faced with a big task. My alarm is off. Social competencies. So social competencies are the skills to interact, make difficult decisions, and cope with new situations. When you think about a typical social emotional learning curriculum, this is really what they are working to teach, these interpersonal skills, and competencies. And so all of these, again, if a student is receiving an SEL curriculum in school, how does that translate to the remote learning environment? It definitely is going to look different. And our work is cut out for us. Last but not least is positive identity, the belief that in one's own self-worth, that they feel that they have control over what happens to them. These have been seriously impacted by COVID-19. A positive view of personal future. Right now, so many of us don't know what's going to happen in the future. A sense of purpose. How is our sense of purpose shifted now that we're all at stay-at-home orders with not a clear timeline of when that will end? Personal power. How do we feel that, do we feel like we have control over things that happen to us? I would argue that a lot of us right now feel that we are really feeling some powerlessness. So how do we shift that and help youth regain some of these assets related to positive identity? And we'll talk about that again on Friday. So that is our general overview of the 40 developmental assets from the Search Institute. We hope that you will join us this week and next week and the week after that for our morning coffee chats and our afternoon bell sessions. This afternoon, we are talking with All Together Now New Hampshire to discuss social communication access with students who are deaf and hard of hearing. We hope you'll tune into that. And then we have a bunch of interesting sessions coming up later in the week. The morning sessions, generally speaking, are going live on Facebook at 9 a.m. unless we have technical difficulties, and then at 3 p.m. on YouTube Live for the afternoon bell. So we hope you will join us, and we hope you're well, and we'll talk soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.